The city was sitting on top of something that was never supposed to be found, and one man accidentally pulled the thread that unraveled over a century of carefully maintained silence. His name was Daniel Marsh. He worked in a municipal records office, the kind of place that smells like old paper and dust and forgotten time, fluorescent lights humming overhead, stacks of folders that nobody has touched in decades lining every wall. It was not a glamorous job. Most days, Daniel processed transfers, cross-referenced property records, filed things that would never be looked at again. That was Tuesday through Friday for 11 years. He was good at it precisely because he had the patience for it, the ability to sit quietly in a room full of dead information and not go out of his mind with boredom. The day it started, he was working through a routine transfer of old engineering documents from a city department that was closing down and digitizing its physical archive. Boxes of technical files, mostly water infrastructure, drainage surveys, underground utility assessments. The kind of material that engineers care about and nobody else does. Daniel was logging the contents, pulling folders, scanning the first page of each to confirm the category, moving on. Methodical, quiet, the radiator in the corner ticking against the cold outside. Then his hands stopped. The folder he was holding did not match the box it came from. The other documents were standard municipal infrastructure work, typed forms, technical measurements, official stamps. This was different. Handwritten, dense pencil lines on large format paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of paper that feels almost cloth-like when it has aged long enough. A survey map, detailed, precise, covering a substantial stretch of the city's west side. But what was mapped was not pipes or drainage channels or utility corridors. It was a network of underground chambers. Daniel laid the map flat on the table and leaned over it. The chambers ran in a rough north-south line beneath what was now some of the most expensive real estate in the city. Each chamber had been measured and noted, consistent ceiling heights, consistent passage widths. The surveyor's handwriting in the margins was careful and neutral, the way professionals write when they are documenting something they do not fully understand and are not being paid to explain. The notes said things like uniform stone construction and passage dimensions consistent throughout and origin unclear, not geological formations. The surveyor knew the difference. He wrote it down and apparently did nothing else with the observation. Daniel turned to the property overlay on the second sheet and felt something shift in his chest. Every single parcel of land drawn above those chambers belonged to the same family. Not a few of them, not most of them, every one. The name stamped across each lot in faded ink was Calloway. He stood there in the hum of the fluorescent lights with the smell of old paper around him and understood, in a way that he could not yet articulate but could absolutely feel, that this map had not ended up in the wrong box by accident. Someone had filed it here, in the most boring possible corner of the municipal archive, specifically because boring corners are where things survive. Hiding something in plain sight, buried under decades of drainage reports and utility logs, where nobody would ever think to look unless they were already looking. The question was not what the map showed. The map was clear enough. The question was how a single family had come to own every square foot of land above a pre-existing underground network that official city records had apparently never acknowledged. And the answer to that question turned out to reach back much further than Daniel had any reason to expect. If you are finding this as interesting as I am, go ahead and subscribe and hit the like button. It genuinely helps, and trust me, where this story goes from here is something you are not going to want to miss. The Calloway family story, the version that appears in business histories and civic commemorations and the kind of plaques that get mounted on buildings, is a genuinely satisfying narrative. Edward Calloway arrived with limited means, built a trading operation through persistence and instinct, identified undervalued properties at exactly the right moment, and accumulated one of the largest private real estate holdings in the city's history. Smart man, Good timing, hard work. It is the kind of story that gets repeated because it confirms something people want to believe about how success works. The problem is the numbers. Daniel did not have a background in financial history, but he knew how to follow a paper trail, and once he pulled the Callaway property records and laid them against the timeline of Edward Callaway's documented income, the math stopped working almost immediately. Within roughly 15 years of arriving with modest documented capital, Callaway was completing property transactions that required resources several times beyond anything his trading operation could have generated, not slightly beyond. Not the kind of gap you close with a good year and careful saving. The kind of gap that means there is a source of money somewhere that is not appearing in any record Daniel could find. And it was not just the scale of the purchases, it was the precision. Callaway was not buying properties along general growth corridors the way any reasonably shrewd investor of that era might have done. He was buying specific parcels in a specific configuration, passing over adjacent lots of apparently similar value, spending more to acquire certain properties than comparable properties nearby would have cost. His contemporaries noticed. Some of them tried to reverse engineer his logic and concluded he was simply making speculative bets on the city's northward expansion. That explanation circulated and eventually became the official one. It does not actually explain the specificity, because if Callaway was betting on northward expansion, he would have bought broadly across the growth corridor to hedge his bets. He did not. He bought a narrow, precise strip of land that followed the same north-south alignment as the underground chambers on the map Daniel had found in a box of drainage reports. Every major acquisition, when plotted against the chamber survey, sat directly above the network. Not near it, not roughly aligned with it. Above it, lot by lot, with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence and cannot be explained by speculation. Callaway was following a map, not the map Daniel found, which came later. A map that Callaway already had before he ever made his first purchase, and wherever that map came from, it came with enough financial backing to act on it at a scale that a trading operation alone could never have supported. The official story says Edward Callaway built his fortune through instinct and hard work. The documents say he built it on access to something that was already in the ground, something he knew about before anyone else in the official record had any reason to know it existed. The question of how he knew is where this story gets genuinely strange. The chambers beneath that city were not natural, and the moment I understood that, everything I thought I knew about the Callaway fortune stopped making sense and started making a different kind of sense entirely. Let me tell you what the survey actually showed, because this is the part that stopped Daniel cold when he finally sat down and read every page of it properly. The map he had found was not a rough sketch. It was a professional document, produced by someone who knew exactly what they were measuring and was careful enough to record every dimension twice. The chambers ran in a line beneath the west side of the city, connected by passages of what the surveyor noted as remarkably uniform width. Not approximately uniform. Remarkably uniform. That word is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and Daniel noticed it. Here is why it matters. When water moves through rock over a very long period of time, it creates passages that follow the path of least resistance. They curve. They narrow and widen unpredictably. They branch in irregular directions. The shapes are organic, which is another way of saying they are messy because nature does not use rulers. What the surveyor was describing beneath the Callaway properties was the opposite of that. Passages that maintained consistent width from one end to the other. Chambers with ceiling heights that varied by almost nothing across their entire span. Walls that the surveyor described in his margin notes as dressed stone, which is a technical term meaning stone that has been cut and shaped deliberately rather than left in its natural form. Dressed stone, cut, shaped by someone. Daniel sat with that for a long time. The radiator in his office had stopped ticking by then. It was late, the building mostly empty, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. He spread the survey sheets across his desk and looked at the pattern of the chambers from above, the way you might look at the floor plan of a building, and that is exactly what it resembled. Not a random scatter of voids, a structure, something designed with intention, with a logic to the layout that suggested whoever built it knew what they were doing and had done it carefully. The surveyor had noted, in the same careful, neutral handwriting, that the stone used in the chamber walls did not match the geological profile of the bedrock surrounding them. He wrote it plainly. The material of construction does not correspond to local stone deposits. He did not speculate about what that meant. He was being paid to assess whether the voids posed a problem for the infrastructure project he was supporting, and the answer to that was yes, route around them. So he did. The deeper question of where the stone came from and who had cut it and why there was a network of engineered chambers beneath the city that appeared in no historical record was apparently not in his brief. But it was in Daniel's now. And the more he looked at those survey sheets, the more one thing became impossible to ignore. The chambers were old, not colonial era old, not a few hundred years old. The surveyor had noted that the stone showed weathering and mineral deposit accumulation consistent with, and here he had written a range that Daniel had to read 3 times before he accepted what it said, an extremely extended period of submersion and exposure. The surveyor did not commit to a specific age. He was a professional, and professionals do not speculate beyond their data. But the language he used pointed towards something that predated any settlement the official history of the region acknowledged. Someone had built a network of engineered stone chambers beneath this city before anyone was supposed to be capable of building them. And the Calloway family had spent generations buying every inch of land above those chambers without ever once, in any public record Daniel could find, acknowledging they existed. The question that had been sitting at the edge of everything since Daniel first unfolded that map now moved to the center. How did Edward Calloway know the chambers were there before any official survey documented them? The answer, when Daniel finally found the thread of it, did not come from financial records or property documents. It came from something much older and much less official than anything stored in a municipal archive. It came from the people who had been living above those chambers long before Edward Calloway ever set foot in the city. And what they knew about what was underground had been passed down through generations in a form that European traders almost universally dismissed as folklore, almost universally. Calloway was the exception, and that exception is what built one of the largest private fortunes in the city's history. Contemporary accounts of Calloway's early trading years describe him in ways that his later admirers found slightly puzzling. He was patient, they said, unusually patient. He spent time in conversation with the people he traded with in a way that went beyond what any commercial transaction required. His competitors moved quickly, exchanged goods, moved on. Calloway sat. He listened. He asked questions about the land, about what was beneath it, about the old stories that the older members of the trading communities told about passages underground and structures of stone that nobody living could remember being built. His competitors thought he was being polite or perhaps simply slow. They were wrong on both counts. Calloway was conducting the most valuable research of his career, and he was doing it in plain sight while everyone around him looked at the pelts and the prices and missed the entire conversation happening just underneath the surface of the transaction. The oral traditions he was gathering described, in the language of story rather than the language of survey, the same network that would later be documented on the sheets of paper Daniel was reading in a nearly empty building on a cold night more than a century later. Underground corridors, stone passages wide enough to walk through, structures built with a precision that the people who described them attributed to builders who were ancient beyond any living memory. Calloway heard these accounts across dozens of conversations over several years. He cross-referenced them. He tested the descriptions against each other for consistency. And then he went back to the city and started buying land with money that, as Daniel had already established, he could not have had without help from somewhere else, which means that by the time Callaway began purchasing the first of his properties above the chamber network, he had already made contact with someone willing to fund the acquisition. Someone who, when Callaway described what the oral traditions pointed toward beneath that particular stretch of land, did not laugh or dismiss it, but instead opened a line of credit and said, "Go." That someone, whoever they were, understood exactly what was down there, and their name appears nowhere in the official record. The second generation of the Callaway family did not just inherit land. They inherited a secret, and they spent their entire lives building a physical cage around it so that nobody would ever accidentally stumble onto what was underneath. Daniel found this part of the story not in financial records, but in construction documents. The kind of dry, technical paperwork that sits in architectural archives and gets consulted maybe once a decade by someone writing a dissertation. He had been pulling files on every major Callaway building project he could identify, working through them methodically the way he worked through everything, folder by folder, page by page. Most of it was exactly what you would expect. Standard specifications, material lists, contractor correspondence, the ordinary paper trail of ordinary construction. And then he hit the basement records. The first thing that jumped out was depth. Every single major structure that the second-generation Callaways built, a hotel on the west side, 2 commercial blocks, a private residence that took up nearly half a city block, had basement excavations that went significantly deeper than the structural requirements of the building above demanded. Not a little deeper, substantially deeper, in ways that added considerable cost to each project, and that the contractors had apparently pushed back on every single time. Daniel found 3 separate letters from 3 separate engineers across 3 separate projects, each one raising the same objection in slightly different language. The additional depth is not structurally necessary and will increase the project cost without providing any corresponding benefit to the stability or longevity of the building. In each case, the Callaway family overruled the objection and paid for the deeper excavation themselves. That alone is strange. But the access shafts are what made Daniel put down his coffee and lean very close to the page. Each basement, in addition to its standard entry points, had what the construction drawings labeled as secondary access corridors. Narrow passages, low-ceilinged, leading from the basement floor downward at a slight angle toward the west. They were not service corridors. They were too narrow and too oddly angled for any practical building function. The drainage systems in each structure connected to these corridors rather than routing outward toward the street-level sewage infrastructure the way every other building in the same period did, water going down and inward rather than out. Daniel stared at the cross-section drawings for a long time. He was not an architect, but he had been working with maps and spatial documents long enough to understand what he was looking at. The Callaway family was not just building above the underground network. They were engineering deliberate physical connections to it from every major structure they owned. They were threading their buildings down into it like roots. One architect who worked on the private residence left a record of his confusion. Not in any published work, because this man apparently never published anything of significance in his career, but in a personal letter to a colleague that ended up in a university archive decades after his death. The letter described his experience working on the Callaway Commission and his bewilderment at the basement specifications. He wrote that the below-ground configuration made no sense to him as an architectural problem. He used a phrase that Daniel read several times because it was so precise. He wrote that the basement felt less like the foundation of a building and more like the entrance to something else entirely. He never found out what that something else was. The letter ends with him describing how he raised the question with the Callaway estate manager and was told politely but firmly that the specifications were not open for discussion. He dropped it. People dropped things when the Calloway family indicated they should be dropped. That was simply how it worked in that era if you wanted to keep your clients and your income. So by the time the generation that came after had settled into managing the family's holdings, the Calloway name sat above a network of properties that were physically integrated with something underground that had been engineered before any documented civilization in the region should have been capable of engineering it. The surface was hotels and commercial buildings and a private residence of extraordinary prestige. Underneath was something that the family had spent 2 generations and a considerable amount of money making sure nobody could access without their knowledge. The cage they had built around the secret was as solid as the stone walls of the chambers themselves. And then a renovation crew with shovels broke straight through it. The renovation project that changed everything was supposed to be routine. The most prestigious of the Calloway properties, a grand private address that had become the social centerpiece of the family's public identity, needed updating. New structural assessment, new design brief, new foundation work in preparation for a significant expansion. The crew sent in to begin the preliminary excavation was experienced, professional, and had no idea what they were walking into. The foreman was a man named Ray Colton, and everything we know about what happened that morning comes from notes he wrote years later in retirement for no audience but himself. Colton described arriving at the site early before most of his crew and going down into the basement alone to assess the floor condition. The air underground was cold and close, the way old basement air always is, carrying the smell of damp stone and decades of settled dust. He had a lamp. He moved along the perimeter of the floor, pressing his boot against the stone at intervals to test for softness or instability. Near the north wall, toward the western corner, the stone shifted under his weight in a way that stone floors should not shift. He stopped. He pressed again. The same movement, a slight give, a sound like something hollow and large registering the pressure from above. He called his crew down. They began clearing the surface carefully, and within less than an hour they had exposed what was underneath. Not a void in the foundation, not a collapsed drainage channel. A passage, wide enough for 2 people walking side by side, high enough to stand in without ducking, walls of fitted stone that Colton described in his notes as cut so cleanly and set so tightly that he could not slide a fingernail into the join between them. He had been doing construction work for most of his adult life. He wrote that he had never seen anything built that way. They went a short distance into the passage with the lamp. Colton wrote about the quality of the silence in there, the way sound seemed to stop at the entrance and not follow them in, the way the air changed from the damp cold of the basement to something drier and older that he did not have words for. And then they found the objects. He described them in his notes only in the vaguest terms, the way a person writes about something when they are not sure language is adequate to the task. He called them things that did not belong underground. He wrote that they were not like any material or equipment from his working life. He wrote that one of them, and here his handwriting changed slightly, became slightly less steady on the page, appeared to be inscribed with markings that he did not recognize as any writing he had ever seen. The estate manager arrived within the hour. By the end of the day, the crew was gone, the passage entrance was sealed, and Ray Colton had money in his pocket and a very clear understanding that this conversation was over before it had started. The Calloway family tore down a perfectly sound building rather than answer one simple question. And when you understand what that decision actually cost them, you start to understand exactly how frightened they were. Daniel had the foreman's notes. He had the sealed passage. He had the objects that Colton described in language that kept breaking down into vagueness the closer it got to the specific. What he did not yet have was any picture of what the family did in the weeks immediately following that morning. So he went looking for it the way he looked for everything, in the gaps between documents, in the letters that were never meant to be read by anyone outside a very small circle. The first fragment came from an architect named Stephen Graves, who had been engaged by the Callaway estate to oversee the renovation project that the discovery had interrupted. Graves left behind a professional correspondence archive that had ended up in a university collection, donated by his family decades after his death. Most of it was routine: project updates, material specifications, client notes. But there was one letter written to a colleague who had apparently asked why the Callaway Commission had suddenly gone quiet that stood out from everything around it. Graves wrote that the project had been suspended due to what he called a significant complication in the lower levels of the property. He wrote that James Callaway, the head of the family at that time, had personally taken charge of managing the situation. He wrote that he had been told to hold all plans pending a resolution that Callaway would communicate directly. And then he wrote one sentence that Daniel read standing up because sitting down suddenly felt insufficient. He wrote that whatever had been found, it had shaken Callaway in a way that Graves had not previously thought possible in a man of that particular temperament, a man who had inherited a multi-generational fortune, who had navigated the most cutthroat property market in the country, who had spent his entire life operating from a position of absolute confidence. Shaken. That word, chosen carefully by a professional writing to a colleague in private, is more revealing than any official statement the Callaway family ever made about anything. The second fragment came from a woman named Helen Marsh, no relation to Daniel, who was at that time one of the most socially connected figures in the city. Her personal diary from that period, preserved in a private collection that Daniel accessed through a research contact, contained several entries referring obliquely to what she called James's difficulty at the house. She did not elaborate. Society diaries of that era were written with the assumption that discretion was its own form of good manners. But the entries noted that Callaway had canceled 2 major social engagements in the weeks following the discovery, that he had been in private meetings with people she did not name, and that the atmosphere around the family had shifted in a way she described as a household that has learned something it cannot unlearn. A household that has learned something it cannot unlearn. The phrase stuck in Daniel's head. It was the most accurate description he had encountered of what the discovery had actually done to the Callaway family, not just a practical problem to be managed, something that had changed the quality of everything around it, the way a crack in a wall changes the way you feel about the room even after you have plastered over it. The renovation project was not just suspended. Within a matter of weeks, it was canceled entirely. And then, in the decision that Daniel kept returning to because it was the most financially and logically extreme response available to the family, James Callaway announced that the building would be demolished, not renovated, not quietly sealed at the basement level and left otherwise intact. Demolished. Taken apart to its foundations and replaced with a completely new structure that would require excavating the entire site and pouring fresh concrete over everything that had been found below. The architects who had been working on the renovation plans were informed by letter. Graves wrote back asking for a meeting to discuss the decision. The meeting was granted. He never recorded what was said in it. His subsequent correspondence on the subject contains only a brief note confirming that he understood the client's wishes and would not be proceeding with the original commission. The building came down. The new construction went up, and beneath the fresh concrete of the new foundation, the sealed passage and everything within it disappeared from any possibility of casual discovery. The most expensive silence in the city's real estate history had been purchased not with money alone, but with the deliberate destruction of the family's most prestigious address. James Callaway spent more to bury that secret than most people in that era spent on anything in their entire lives. And the archive of the demolished building, when Daniel went looking for it, was exactly wrong in a very specific way. The records that survived were the ones that told you nothing useful. Exterior photographs of the facade, social records, guest registers, correspondence about decorative choices and furniture arrangements. The kind of documentation that tells you what a building looked like from the outside, and who attended parties inside it. What was almost entirely absent was the structural record. No basement-level drawings from the renovation assessment period. No photographs of the interior below the ground floor. No engineering notes from the preliminary excavation that had preceded the discovery. The gap was not uniform the way natural archive decay tends to be, where documents are lost randomly across all categories. It was surgical. Everything above ground, relatively intact. Everything below ground, gone. Daniel had worked in archives long enough to know the difference between a collection that had suffered the ordinary losses of time and a collection that had been selectively thinned. Time takes things at random. People take things with purpose. And whoever had gone through the Callaway archive had known exactly which category of document to remove while leaving enough of the rest to avoid an obvious gap that would attract the kind of attention that obvious gaps attract. The question was not whether the archive had been deliberately cleaned. The evidence for that was clear enough once you knew what you were looking for. The question was where the removed documents had gone, and more importantly, where the objects from the passage had gone, because Ray Colton's notes placed them underground on the morning of the discovery, and the sealed passage placed them underground at the end of that day, but somewhere between the sealing of that passage and the demolition of the building above it, someone had made arrangements for those objects that the official record did not document, and the institution those arrangements pointed toward was not a private collection or a family vault. It was something much larger, much more official, and much better equipped to make unusual things permanently invisible. The objects from that passage did not vanish. They were moved through a system so well established and so quietly efficient that by the time Daniel traced the thread to its end, he realized the Callaway family had not improvised a cover-up at all. They had simply used infrastructure that already existed for exactly this purpose. Daniel had been building his picture piece by piece, the way you assemble something in low light, finding the edges first and working inward. He had the survey map. He had the property records. He had Graves's letter and Helen Marsh's diary and Ray Colton's private notes. What he had been missing was the destination. Where do you take objects that you cannot publicly acknowledge and cannot safely destroy? The answer, when he found it, was hiding in the most official place imaginable. In the same general period as the Callaway discovery, there was a documented and historically acknowledged pattern at one of the country's most prominent national institutions. Not alleged, not speculative, actually documented by independent researchers who spent years cross-referencing acquisition logs against public exhibition records. The pattern was straightforward and consistent. Unusual archaeological finds from across the continent were received, logged under internal reference numbers, and then quietly removed from any publicly accessible catalog. Not destroyed, stored, filed in the institutional equivalent of the municipal archive where Daniel worked, the place where things go when someone needs them to exist officially but not publicly. The documented cases follow a recognizable shape. Metalwork recovered from sites that should not have contained metalwork of that type or complexity. Ceramic objects with surface treatments inconsistent with any identified tradition from the region. Stone fragments bearing markings that did not correspond to any known symbol system and that the institution's own internal notes described as requiring further specialist analysis that apparently never produced any published finding. Each of these items was received, each was logged, each disappeared into a storage classification that was not accessible through standard research requests. Daniel found a reference, buried in a footnote of an academic paper about institutional collection practices, to a category of acquisitions described in internal documents as material of indeterminate cultural origin, pending assessment. The footnote cited a collection of internal logs from the relevant period. Daniel requested access to those logs through the appropriate channels. He was informed that the relevant files were held in a restricted storage category and were not available for general research review. He sat with that response for a long time. The refusal was polite. It was also, given everything else he had assembled, the most clarifying thing anyone had said to him in months, because a collection of assessment logs from that period, describing objects received and not yet categorized, would under normal archival practice have been released to researchers decades ago. The restriction was not a bureaucratic delay. It was a decision. Someone had made a deliberate choice to keep those particular logs unavailable, and that choice was still being maintained. The Calloway family had handed the objects to an institution with both the authority and the practical capacity to make them invisible within a legitimate structure. No theft, no destruction, no obvious crime. Just a transfer from private hands to official custody, filed under a classification that ensured they would never surface in any public exhibition or research publication. The system had not been built specifically for the Calloway discovery. It had been built for exactly this category of problem, and by the time the objects from that passage arrived, the people receiving them knew precisely what to do. What Daniel understood now, sitting in his office with the survey map and the property records and the fragments of correspondence spread across his desk, was that the cover-up had never required a single dramatic decision or a single powerful individual pulling every string. It had required something much simpler and much harder to dismantle. It had required a series of separate people, each operating within their own professional role, each making choices that were individually defensible, that together produced a single outcome. A foreman who took his payment and kept quiet, an architect who dropped an uncomfortable question when told to, a family that demolished a building and called it ambition, an institution that filed unusual objects under a classification nobody could access and called it standard procedure. No single person in that chain needed to know the whole picture. They only needed to know their part of it and to understand, without anyone having to say it directly, that their part was not to be discussed. And that network, that quiet distributed system of maintained silence, was still functioning, not because the Calloway family still existed in any meaningful form. Their name had faded from public prominence generations ago, their properties sold and redeveloped, their social connections dissolved by time. The silence persisted because the institutions that had absorbed their secret were still operating, still maintaining the same restricted classifications, still processing research access requests with the same polite refusals. The underground network itself was the final proof of everything Daniel had assembled. He found it not in historical documents, but in recent ones. Engineering reports from a major infrastructure project conducted in the same corridor of the city, filed through standard municipal channels and technically available to anyone who knew to look for them. The crews working on that project had encountered a series of pre-existing underground voids that complicated their tunneling work in specific locations. The reports described the voids as presenting unexpected structural considerations and noted that their geological origin could not be determined through standard analysis. The engineering solution was to map the voids, adjust the tunnel route to avoid the largest ones, and proceed. Nobody reading those reports had any reason to connect them to a hand-drawn survey map sitting in a misfiled folder in a municipal archive. Nobody had any reason to connect the voids to the Calloway property records, or the demolished building, or the foreman who wrote private notes in retirement about dressed stone walls and objects he had no words for. The engineers had a practical problem. They found a practical solution, and they moved on. The chambers, built too solidly to be removed and too old to be explained, simply absorbed another generation of people working around them and asking no further questions. Daniel laid everything out on his desk in the order he had found it. The misfiled survey map that started everything. The property records showing the precise alignment of Calloway acquisitions above the chamber network. The financial gaps that pointed to unnamed European backing. The construction documents with their anomalous basement depths and downward-running access shafts. The architect's letter about shaken temperament. The society diary entries about a household that had learned something it could not unlearn. The foreman's private notes with their failing handwriting at the critical moment. the demolished building and its surgically thinned archive, the institutional refusal that confirmed rather than denied, the engineering reports from decades later describing the same voids in the language of a practical problem with no historical context. Each piece on its own was a fragment. Together, they described something complete and deeply unsettling. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a room full of powerful men planning in unison, something quieter and more durable than that. A truth that had been kept below the surface not through any single act of suppression, but through the accumulated weight of people choosing again and again to let the floor stay sealed. Daniel thought about the survey map, the one that had ended up in the wrong box in the most boring corner of the archive. He thought about the person who had filed it there, whoever they were, and whether they had known exactly what they were doing, whether they had understood that the most reliable way to preserve something dangerous was not to destroy it, but to bury it somewhere so unremarkable that nobody would think to look. Not a vault, a box of drainage reports, not a locked room, an open shelf in a place where time moves slowly and attention rarely arrives. The truth about the Callaway fortune, about the chambers beneath the city, about the objects that traveled from a sealed passage into a restricted institutional collection, had survived precisely because it had been treated as something too small and too dull to notice. The people who managed the silence had understood something important. You do not need to erase a thing to make it disappear. You only need to make sure it ends up somewhere that feels like it does not matter. The question that stayed with Daniel, the one he could not file away or cross-reference into resolution, was not about the Callaway family or the objects or even the chambers themselves. It was simpler than that and considerably harder to sit with. If a network of engineered stone passages of unknown origin runs beneath one of the most developed and documented stretches of land in the country, and that network has been independently encountered and recorded by multiple separate surveys across more than a century, and every single time it has been noted and worked around and left unexplained, then the question is not whether the official history of who was here first is incomplete. The question is whether anyone in a position to complete it actually wants to. Here is what this entire story comes down to. The most effective way to bury a truth is not to fight it. It is to surround it with paperwork, to file it in the right category, to make sure that the people who encounter it have a practical reason to move on. The Callaway fortune was built on something real. The silence around it was built on something even more durable, the simple human preference for the version of the world that does not require you to revise everything you thought you understood. So here is the question I want you to think about and answer below. If you were the one who broke through that floor and found what Ray Colton found, and someone handed you an envelope of cash and told you to walk away, would you? And if you say no, think about it again. Because the version of you that says yes already knows exactly how much silence costs and has already decided it is worth it. If this story made you think, hit the like button and subscribe. There is more down here than any one video can cover, and I am not done digging.